my
It's a little bit of a
brain.
How about now?
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. 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 The microphones are working. Do you want me to take your coat? What, how about in my closet? Well, this is a pretty good turnout, Dr. Cavallo. Do you say Cavallo or Cavallo?
I say Cavallo
Yeah.
because it's Italian.
Right. Good. Very good. Thank you very much. Of course. So, welcome to this wonderful audience joining us in person, and also those watching online through the Facebooks. Welcome to the first of the Ballard Institute and Museum of Puppetry's Spring Puppet Forum series. Come on in, welcome. Thank you for being here with our guest, Dr. Joan Cavallo of Columbia University, speaking on the Sicilian puppet theater of Agrippino, Manteo, 1884 to 1947, the Paladins of France in America. And that happens to be the title of Dr. Cavallo's book, a copy of which is on the back there, the back table, next to the cookies. This event is co-sponsored by the University of Connecticut Italian Literary and Cultural Studies program, and thanks to those from that program who are here, we really appreciate connecting with you, and the Connecticut Italian Teachers Association. Is anybody here from that organization? That's okay. I'm John Bell, I'm the director of the Ballard Institute, and I'm here this evening with my colleague Emily Wicks, manning the camera, our manager of operations and collections, as well as Khushbu Dalani, our talented museum assistant, working on a BA in applied data analysis with a concentration in public policy, which has direct connections to puppetry, and it's a delight to work with. Our education and exhibitions coordinator, Anthony Solito, is right now working on a new puppet production at Skidmore College. Please turn off or silence your electronic devices. Did I do that? And the exits are to your left, where that red sign is, and you can go back, exit the way you came in. There's an exit going into the bookstore, but I don't know when the bookstore closes.
Closed. Don't use that exit.
Don't do that because the alarms go off and the police come, and it's unpleasant. And the restrooms are out that way in the back hall on the other side of those two doors. So, good. We wanted to let you know that our brand new exhibition, Taking Care, Puppets and Their Collectors, curated by Dr. Jung-Min Sung, just opened. It's a great exhibit. It'll be up at least to the end of June and probably into July. It celebrates many puppet-oriented collectors who have bestowed on the Ballard Institute an amazing array of puppets, including 3 Manteo family puppets in the first gallery, and then another Sicilian puppet and some miniature Sicilian puppets in the second gallery, and a Tunisian puppet, which is the result of Sicilian puppets moving in Tunisia with the Italian occupation, and then being performed with the opposite binary, where the Muslims are the good guys and the Christians are the bad guys. Very interesting. So that's happening right now. Wonderful exhibit. And the museum is open Wednesday through Friday, 11 to 5, Saturday and Sunday from 11 to 7. And our Spring Puppet Performance Series begins this Saturday with Liz Joyce and a couple of puppets, that's the name of her company, from Long Island, performing Little Red Riding Hood right here in this room at 11 a.m. Saturday the 24th. So if you need more information about that, there's our website and the Facebooks and
Flyers
the
on the
stuff
back
on
page.
flyers highlights of the whole season, the spring season. And this is the first of a whole bunch of puppet forms. Another flyer also available. Good. So, Sicilian marionette theater has been one of the most dramatic and powerful popular art forms to come to the U.S. through the immigration of millions of folks from Europe. Like many forms of puppetry, it has not been too well documented or analyzed. Surprise, surprise. But Dr. Joanne Cavallo has done just that in her new book, The Sicilian Puppet Theater of Agrippino Manteo, 1884 to 1947, The Paladins of France in America. And we have some discount flyers in the back there and a copy of the book, discount flyers, and you can get a discount buying the book online. So please take advantage of that. Joanne is a professor of Italian and chair of the Italian department at Columbia University. She's published widely on Italian literature and culture, especially chivalric epic and popular traditions. Her latest book, The Sicilian Puppet Theater of Agrippino Manteo, was recently awarded an Unima USA Nancy Staub Award. Congratulations. And is forthcoming in Italian, which is very interesting. Her previous book, The World Beyond Europe and the Romance Epics of Boiardo and Ariosto, received a Modern Language Association Publication Award and was also translated into Italian. She's edited several volumes, most recently World Epics and Puppet Theater, which I think is all online, right? It's digital, and our colleague Matthew Cohen was involved with a lot of that. And Teaching World Epics, and a series editor of the Anthem World Epic and Romance book Stories. Here's a short quotation from a recent review by Maria Gali Stampino of Dr. Cavallo's book from the journal Italian Culture. With this volume, Joanne Cavallo offers us a rare gift and the in-depth analysis of a topic that is both rooted in literary sources and the expression of popular culture, of a regional performance tradition that's spread through and thanks to the Italian diaspora, and of a neglected subject that deserves sustained attention and additional research. The author achieves this by focusing on one individual, his life story, and the texts and objects that he left to his family and descendants. Agrippino Manteo, born in Sicily, specifically Gramichele, thank you, near Catania in 1883, who migrated to Argentina first after 1905 and later to New York. So we're lucky to have recently acquired, as I mentioned earlier, 3 Manteo puppets from Michael Manteo, the great-grandson of Agrippino. And some of us have been privileged to see such marionettes in action. They're quite amazing and profound. I was mentioning to Dr. Cavallo that back in the day, I worked with Bread and Puppet Theater, which is very influenced by the Manteo family marionettes in terms of aesthetics of puppetry and stuff like that, which is really interesting to me. And we went out to a Macy's department store in Long Island, and Mike Manteo, Agrippino's son, was giving a demonstration and talking about the effect these puppets had, and that the audiences for these puppets were so engaged in the drama and struggle that at one point he said one of the people got up in the audience, and Gano de Maganza, the big villain, was on stage, and he took out a gun and he shot the puppet with a gun. That doesn't happen very often. But it's part of the intensity of this form of puppetry that you could be so engaged with this puppetry. So after that long introduction, I just want to say welcome to you. Thank you so much for being here and talking about this exciting subject.
Thank you, John. Does anybody hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, John, for that introduction, but most of all, thank you and Emily for your kindness throughout these years. I want to start with not an anecdote, but a bit of background. I was invited to talk in April of 2020, so the book was not finished yet, and then the pandemic happened, and so no one was visiting anywhere. But But one of the things I had planned to do during that period was to travel to India, Iran, Japan, and Italy with a project called World Epic in Puppet Theater. And it was through a Columbia grant, and I had this, which I now think was a crazy idea, to bring colleagues to these 4 different countries to exchange ideas with puppeteers and the public about puppetry. But because of the pandemic, it didn't happen. And so we had an online puppet play and presentation in Italy at the International Museum of Marionettes. And then I needed to find a place to host the other 3 events for Iran, India, and Japan. And the first place I thought of was the Ballard Institute, and I'm very grateful that John and Emily took me up on that. And in the middle of their always full and very packed schedule, very graciously hosted the screening of 3 performances of epic plays, of Iranian, Japanese, and Indian plays. And John moderated the Q&A afterwards with the master puppeteers and other scholars in the field. So thanks to the Ballard Institute, we had the project reach its fulfillment and later turned also into a volume, which is World Epics and Puppet Theater, which isn't limited to those 4 countries, but in 14 essays goes from Europe to Africa to various parts of Asia, with 2 essays in Italian, 1 in French, and 11 in English, and it's online at no charge. So if you're interested in puppetry, there are some amazing photographs as well. So I invite you to look for the journal online. It's published by the journal AQU, AOQU. And if you don't find it, email me, jac3@columbia.edu, and I'll send you the link or the PDF. Okay, so with that out of the way, there's one more preliminary, because 2 people have already asked me however I got into this topic. And I explained to the first person, to the second person, I said, okay, well wait, I'll just quickly say that when I start the talk tonight. And that is, I had been studying epic for, I guess, 20 years or so. And a friend of mine from Sicily brought me 3 souvenir puppets of Angelica, Orlando, and Rinaldo, and said, well, those stories that you teach at Columbia, they're still being performed in Sicily in puppet theater. And so I became very excited, and for the next 3 or 4 summers, I went to Sicily armed with my video camera and met puppeteers, interviewed them, and filmed the puppet plays that happened to be performed at that time. And a lot of that material I put on my website called eBoiardo. And you can go under puppet theater. They're divided by author, they're divided by puppeteers, there are interviews. But still, I didn't know about Sicilian puppet theater in America. And there was a student who took a course that I teach every so often called Italian Chivalric Epic and Popular Performance Traditions, and where I taught Sicilian puppet theater. And she got so enthusiastic that the next semester she took a course in anthropology and did a final paper on Sicilian puppet theater in America, where she was supposed to go interview Sicilian puppeteers. So she found the descendants of Agrippino Manteo, looking them up, I guess, in the phone book. I don't actually remember how she found them. And she asked me if I wanted to go with her to interview the granddaughter and grandson of this famous puppeteer, Agrippino Manteo. And of course I did. And she handed in her final paper and then didn't pursue it anymore. But I became hooked on the family and especially on their scripts. And so that's what I basically started doing pretty seriously from 2015 until a couple years ago. So with that, let me
go
to the right.
Oh, here. I have to open this, and then
start off with an image of a female warrior, Marfisa, because she's not in any of the magazines or newspapers. It's a puppet that Agrippino's granddaughter, Susie Bruno, has in her home and keeps very close to her heart. So it's a very personal puppet for Susie, but it's also such a beautiful, beautiful puppet of a female warrior. And I really invite you to come back to the exhibit and see the 3 Manteo puppets that are outside. There are 2 Christians and 1 Saracen soldier. And I also have a few more puppets to show you today. But I'm going to start off with a stereotype inside of a stereotype. So how many of you have seen The Godfather Part 2? Okay, so there's this scene where the mafioso is walking through a festival in Little Italy. He stops in front of the puppet theater. He makes the comment, "Oh, well, that's too violent for me." And it's ironic because, of course, he had, after a life of violence himself, he is about to be assassinated. And so the little bit of a sword fight on stage is really nothing compared to real life. So I'm showing this image to you for 2 reasons. First, these are Manteo puppets, because in the early 1970s, if you're going to film puppets in New York and you're looking for people to manipulate them, the only family you're basically going to find are the Manteos. So it's not random at all that Coppola engaged the Manteo family to perform the puppetry scene in his film. But the second reason that I'm showing you this just to start off is that despite the irony of the episode, it's true that the impression we have of Sicilian puppet theater is a bunch of violence. The sword fights on scene, the faces slashed off, the body broken into 2 and then piled up. How many of you have seen puppet theater in Sicily? So one person can say if I'm telling the truth or not. So the rest of you will, I guess, have to trust me on this, because the plays today are mostly staged for tourists who come to Sicily. It's the way that puppet theater has been kept alive through schools, so it's showing school children, but mainly showing tourists puppet theater, which is no longer about the stories, but it's about the folklore. Even you can find posters in the tourist office that have a poster of a puppet that just says folklore. And so what you get, expecting people not to even know Italian or to know the stories, you get the technique, you get the mastery of the battle, of the choreography. And so that, I think, is the impression that we have nowadays, that puppet theater is all about just the fighting. And when it comes to traditional Sicilian puppet theater, nothing could be further than the truth. This is a very elaborate, intricate storyline that goes on. It can go on up to a year. And I wanted to first say a few things about the basic text that is at the basis of all traditional Sicilian puppet theater. Previously, up until the 1858, 1860, for Sicilian puppet theater, the chivalric repertory was coming from the Renaissance epic poems, and they were adapted for the stage. What Giusto Lovico did in his first installments from 1858 to 1860 was to put in chronological order the various stories that were being either told on the town square or performed in puppet theater based on the canonical works of the Italian Renaissance. So Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato, Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, Tasso's Rinaldo, Pucci's Morgante, and many others. He put together, either in whole or in part, at least 20 chivalric poems from the Renaissance. And scholars have identified 20 sources. There may even be more, and he added some of his own material as well. The totality of this was almost 3,000 pages. And this became the undisputed source of Sicilian puppet theater. It was called the Bible of the Puppeteers. It was just simply called the book, un libro. And Giusto Ludico was considered the author. The puppeteers and the public even wouldn't consider the names of the original poets. It wouldn't be the work of Boiardo or Ariosto. It was always the work of Ludico. The work was so popular that in 1895, 1896, an editor, Giuseppe Leggio, added on to it because the 3,000 pages just wasn't enough. And so he added a prequel taken from Andrea da Barberino's Reale di Francia. He inserted other episodes. So this is just a monumental work in the Italian language that's an adaptation of mostly Renaissance sources. We know that Agrippino used this, first of all, because this is Agrippino's copy. It's from a 1909 edition, but also because he follows very carefully the entire progression and trajectory of the knights in this work. So before I say anything more about the scripts, I'm going to go back to the beginning. Oh, I'll show you a picture of the scripts.
Did you want to go? No.
I'm going to go to the history, but I forgot I had added in to give you an idea of what the scripts look like. Because what happened is that even though Giusto Ludico was everyone's source, each family had their own scripts in which they would write out sometimes the dialogue and sometimes just the action. But these scripts are very hard to come by because those that were not destroyed are generally privately owned by the remaining puppeteer families, and it's not that they lend them out, or by collectors who maybe guard them even more jealously, or they're in Italian institutions where you have to get on a plane and make appointments and then go digging them out of archives. So puppet theater scripts are very little accessible. And that's why Agrippino Manteo, I think, is so important, not only for the history of puppet theater in America, but for the history of puppet theater in general, because he gives us a window into what was actually going on the stage of puppet theater, l'opera dei pupi, in Sicily, because he brought it to the United States. So these scripts, and I'll say more about the scripts later, are all in his very meticulous handwriting, and here you have an example. Now I'll go back to the beginning. To Sicily. And Agrippino Manteo was born in, as Dr. Bill said, in Gran Michele, which is in the province of Catania. So there was the tradition that there's a lot of oral lore about it. It wasn't fully documented, but most historians say that the improvements in the armor that made Sicilian puppet theater what it is today happened in the early 1800s, and so there was a Palermo province and another in eastern Sicily in the Catania province as the two poles. So Agrippino Manteo was born in 1884, and we have the exact document because his great-grandson Michael Manteo went to Gran Michele and he had a copy of the birth certificate made. But after that, there is nothing written about Agrippino Manteo in Sicily. There is the family memory. And so what the family memory passes on is that Agrippino was orphaned at a very young age. It's reported in newspaper articles as early as just some months old. His granddaughter Susie says he could have been 4 years old. And he was sent to live at his maternal grandmother's farm with his older sister Teresa. And apparently was not happy and ran away because of incessant farm chores. But the foundational moment for Agrippino was his encounter with Giuseppe Crimi, also called Agrippino Crimi. And again, it's family memory, but it's a beautiful story that his granddaughter told me, in which Agrippino went to see Peppino Crimi perform in Gran Michele, because at the time there were tours around Sicily, and he fell in love with the performance and went backstage afterwards to talk to the puppeteer and say that his father was Michele Manteo. And the puppeteer said, well, your father was a puppeteer, he was a friend, and I will take you under my wing. And we don't know if the story is true, but I particularly am fond of it because it is a link to Agrippino's father, an identification with the tradition of puppet theater, and the discovery of a new father, the mentor, his mentor, Giuseppe Crimi. And it was an exceptional thing to have Giuseppe Crimi as one's mentor, because Giuseppe's father was Gaetano Crimi. Gaetano was the founder of Sicilian puppetry in eastern Sicily and the foremost practitioner of the art in the first half of the 19th century. We have the fortune of memoirs written by Giuseppe about his father. So we know from those memoirs that Gaetano's own father was a music and violin teacher. So a family of teachers and of music. And that Gaetano was not only a puppeteer who opened his first theater in 1835, but he also was a theater director who staged plays with live actors. And so there's this crossover and this merging of classics of Greek and Italian literature, comedies and dialect, but the use of both puppets and live actors by the same person, by the same director. And not only was Giuseppe involved in his father's productions, but he says that he was the most devoted of his apprentices, and he in turn combined puppetry with live dramatic theater. And this was, so Agrippino's models and mentors had this dual role, and I think it points to the cross-pollination between dramatic theater and puppet theater, but also the common elements. And it allows us to see puppet theater, especially Catanese puppet theater of the time, as a form of dramatic prose theater with very elaborate plots and intricate dialogue that could be staged with wooden puppets or live actors. And so Agrippino inherited this. And I think this could explain various things. The passion and theatrical notions that he brought to his art, the high caliber of his production that made his name famous for decades, and also the cultural educational program behind his repertoire. So I'm going to move on, because even though Catania was the avant-garde of theater and puppet theater of the time, it wasn't really a great place to make a living if you have a family. So Agrippino fell in love, married his wife Caterina, had a daughter Ida, but in 1905 he emigrated from Sicily. His older sister Teresa had gone to Mendoza, Argentina with her husband, and in 1905 Agrippino followed them, and then 6 months later his wife and daughter followed suit. And the family remembers that in Mendoza, Agrippino opened a bakery, but also a puppet theater. Unfortunately, there was World War I, and Italy called back to fight any of the Italian citizens abroad in the diaspora. So Agrippino was called back to Italy, leaving his wife, and here you see, his wife Caterina, his sister Teresa, and the children who were not only Ida born in Italy, but 3 sons who were born in Argentina, Mike, Dominic, and Ritz. And I'm very fond of this photo because you can see Ida holding a doll. And has anyone seen Tony DeNono's It's One Family Knock on Wood about the Manteos? It's a 25-minute documentary. It's very beautiful. And Ida, many, many decades later, probably in her 60s, if not older, calls the puppets dolls. And so to see her holding a doll here, and to think that for her there's a lot of continuation between the playfulness with dolls and her life way devoted to puppetry.
And is it in Italian, puppe is that, it is the same word for doll and puppet, is that?
There's also bambole for doll.
Okay, excuse me.
But yeah, it's and there's an Italianist Tina here who can be even more precise.
I don't know actually. The question, it would have to do with the dialect as well. It means the same thing. I don't know.
Okay. So after the war, Agrippino did not return to Argentina. Instead, he went to New York City, where he also had relatives. And that was in 1919. So this photograph could be around 1916 because his 3 sons were also born, and there's a little baby in the picture. So in 1919, he arrived in New York, and then he had his wife and 4 children join him, as well as, the family says, 80 of the marionettes that he had constructed there, which they say were 300. It's hard to tell, but they didn't bring them all. They had 80 transported according to the memory of the family. In New York, by day, Agrippino was an electrician. And I think this is the earliest photo we have of Agrippino from 1922. I have paddle fans that look like that, so this design hasn't changed. But so this was Agrippino by day. By night, he was a master puppeteer, bringing to life the stories of the paladins of France for audiences of fellow immigrants. And here you can see him reading from the script. And that's what the scripts look like that are preserved today. Notebooks of basically that size. And so in the Catania tradition, you'd operatore reading the lines and also improvising, where the manipulators on the bridge would handle the puppets. Whereas in the Palermo tradition with smaller puppets, you have the main puppeteer who could speak the lines but also manipulate the puppet or handle the puppet from the side. So here you can see very clearly this is the Catania tradition. But everyone in the family had a role. So here you can see his sons who are on top of the bridge manipulating the puppets, which in the Catania tradition could weigh from 50 to 100 pounds. And Dr. Bailey, you want to confirm the 3 Manteo puppets that you set up?
They're really hard. They're really heavy. It's hard.
So maybe an average of 80 pounds, okay, for a puppet. So you needed muscles. Because you have to, even if the hook would be on the bridge, you'd have to get the puppet back on and off, and then also manipulate from above. So the sons would be occupied with handling the puppets. The wife, Caterina, you see her here collecting entrance fees, but she also designed and sewed the costumes, and she lent the female voice to her voice to the female characters. This is something characteristic of Catanese puppet theater, and already it was documented that Gaetano Crimi used female speakers for the female voices. Whereas in Palermo, if you've heard the Palermo tradition, the male puppeteers characteristically also give the female voices. They may raise their a little bit in the falsetto, not necessarily, but they do all of the voices, which makes love scenes a little more comic because and less dramatic. And in the Catanese tradition, there you'll find much more drama and emotion. Then, daughter Ida, who is on the left with her 2 sister-in-laws, also lent her voice to the female puppets, the female characters. She sewed costumes, she painted scenery, and she also played the piano. So she was fully involved in puppet theater, and she also did some theater on the side with the Italian community. So she followed in her father's footsteps and that of his mentors by combining puppet theater with live theater. Agrippino was the master puppeteer, so he directed all of the action. He spoke the male lines. He constructed the puppets with the collaboration of a sculptor who sculpted the heads. And here you can see during a scene that fire is burning center stage, so you have special effects. And in the scripts, there's not a lot of commentary, but one of the rare comments in the margins is Agrippino saying what an effect fire has when it's used, because it creates a glow that absorbs the audience's attention. So if we consider that Agrippino staged his plays from the early 1920s until the late 1930s, and also opened a puppet theater in Argentina before the war, he probably staged over 6,000 plays in the course of his career, because the plays were shown on a nightly basis. And so here we have him in Little Italy, maybe at the height of his career. And here we have him with his son Johnny, who's the youngest son, who was born in New York City. So the only son, the only child who was born in the U.S., He was born in 1921. So this is really a polyglot family, like a really, say, multicultural, from Sicily to, so Sicilian, Italian, Argentina, and New York. And here you can see once again the centrality of the scripts. The father and son are discussing, it looks like, a script prior to a performance. The sad news is that in 1939, Johnny, at the age of 18, after graduating from high school, got tuberculosis and died in July of that year. And Agrippino was so grief-stricken that he never performed again. So from the sickness and death of his son in 1939, he closed his theater, and in his son Mike's diary, there are lines saying, "My father was never the same again. We were all worried." He died in 1947, so without having performed again during his lifetime. But his passion was so contagious that the remaining children decided that their puppet theater could not die. And so they carried it on, they carried on the tradition for the next 4 decades. From 1950, and there's actually a flyer announcing the first performance that the family staged following Agrippino's death. It's a benefit performance after school in 1950, and they use a photograph in which Agrippino is in the bottom right, and his puppets are on stage. And from that time, the family did not, of course, return to staging puppet plays every night because there was no audience for that. But the fact that there was not an Italian immigrant audience meant that they could share this tradition with new audiences. So they branched out with a different, say, cultural and social venue in different performance spaces in New York, also as far as Washington, D.C. for puppet festivals. They did Italian-American community festivals. They performed in schools. They basically performed wherever anyone invited them. And you can see that Mike and Ida are on the bottom, standing with the cast of characters, and above them are actually all of them are the family, except for Derek Hunter, who was one of the young people, or one of the students, who saw a performance by the Manteos in a Brooklyn junior high or high school. I think it was actually junior high, and was so interested in the puppets that Mike Manteo invited him to the workshop and then offered him a part-time job. And so Derek Hunter ended up working with the Manteos part-time for 8 years. And so he was the only one, except for sometimes piano player, who was not part of the Manteo family, or he was an honorary family member. Here you have them at the Symphony Space. They perform very frequently there. And here you have a picture of them backstage. So they're no longer performing for Italian-American immigrants. They're performing for New Yorkers or, say, an American audience. You can see backstage that it still takes the playing of the piano, the assistants, Mike, who is throwing the lines, as he would say, the manipulators on the bridge. And something else that was different is that they no longer went back to the scripts of the Paladins of France in order to find the repertory. They invented single plays of their own, and the playbills that the family preserved give with the synopsis, and so you have a summary of what the play actually was. And you have Orlando, who is wandering around seeking Angelica, his beloved, which goes back to the paladins of France. But he comes across these star-crossed lovers who are attacked by a terrible giant, and he saves them. So that story that they invent and bring to invented and brought to American spectators couldn't be found in the original scripts, but the spirit of it was that of the knight in shining armor who helps those in distress. And here you have Orlando, and I wrote Di Comparsa because the puppeteer and scholar Alessandro Napoli explained to me that this particular armor would have been only when Orlando was having speaking parts. This would not be the Orlando puppet who would be fighting in a battle and getting his armor dented or damaged. So there was a separate, for Orlando and Rinaldo, there was a separate puppet dressed for occasions where he could just shine without worrying about getting beaten up. And here's a picture of Susie Bruno, the granddaughter of Agrippino, her late husband, and a giant Balahim, an invented character who's not part of the Paladins of France cycle, that in their list of characters they call a mighty pagan giant, ruthless against all Christians. And so it's an invented character who's very colorful and lively. So Mike Manteo had the dream of opening a permanent theater in New York, and by the late 1980s, he had an agreement with the Staten Island Museum, I think officially called Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences, and the 115 Manteo puppets were housed there, and they had a collaboration where the Manteo family would give performances, workshops, demonstrations, and the idea was to have the Manteo family as a regular part of the Staten Island Museum. Another sad note is that the same month as that announcement, in 1989, Mike Manteo passed away. So the puppets did not remain for many more years at the Staten Island Institute. They ended up in the garage of Mike's son Pino for several years. And in fact, when I went with my former student to interview Pino and Susie, Pino took us to the garage. And I do have on the eBoyardo website the visit of the puppets hanging in the garage with Pino making comments about them. And they were just there waiting for a home. And the good news is that in 2010, the Manteo family donated over 30 puppets to the Italian-American Museum of New York. And the museum is set to reopen at the end of May or beginning of June, and it will feature an exhibit of these 30 Manteo puppets so that you can go and look at them close up. And I said I would come back to the scripts, and Agrippino Manteo was not only a puppeteer, he was also a playwright. And I want to give you just one example. So in the In the book, I translate 8 plays. I translate, I think, all of the extant synopses, which are 285 of the 330. And then I give an introduction and a comparative analysis of these 8 plays from the arrival of Angelica in Paris, the Orlando going mad, the Battle of Lampedusa. So I guess the most famous episodes from the cycle. So right tonight, I just want to leave you with an example of Agrippino Manteo's creative art as a playwright. A background to the scene that I'm going to show you. Astolfo of England is the knight who wins a tournament in Paris. So he's the absolute victor, except that evil Gano di Magonza and his clan attack him from behind and then slander him, and a fight ensues. Charlemagne, Carlomagno, believes, of course, Gano and not Astolfo, and has Astolfo, the victor of the joust, imprisoned indefinitely and forgets about him. So for months, he's just away in prison until Gradasso di Sericana of East Asia comes all the way to France, invades Paris, defeats the Christians, captures Charlemagne. And here's where I pick up, we have Astolfo and Carlomagno, and these puppets were photographed when they were at the Staten Island Institute, and so they're also numbered. And here's Gano. Looking a little. So, in the Renaissance poem by Boiardo, Orlando Innamorato, we find that the Christian populace turned in flight. Okay, so the Christians are fleeing, the churches are opened, and the prisons. It's very random. Like, who opened them? We don't know. They were just opened. There's chaos. Astolfo was released with the others. So there's no thought to Astolfo at all. He just happens to exit with everyone else. And then he assumed command of the kingdom. Why? Because there's a power vacuum. Somebody's got to take control, and it's Astolfo. So this is all we get with Boiardo. And Boiardo has this incredibly long poem, but at this particular moment, the details are quite sparse. Giusto Logico, who not only reassembles these 20 Renaissance poems, but also adds his own material, likes to also add detail, make things make sense, elaborate. So he writes, those people, that is the people of Paris, who had no longer remembered the Englishman's imprisonment, once they became aware of it, went to release him, and each voluntarily submitted to his command, whereby Astolfo comforted those citizens, asserting that the new day would make the pagan repent of having dared so much. He then went to comfort the empress. So you can see what he adds here. First of all, it's the people who go to release Astolfo. It's not a random act anymore, but it's the will of the people that Astolfo be set free. And Astolfo just doesn't assume command. He is given it by the people. And he comforts Galerana, the empress, who is not mentioned at all by Boiardo in this particular scene. So it makes Astolfo seem more of a caring figure. Okay, so now for the good part. What does Agrippino Manteo do? First of all, he creates 2 scenes, because one isn't enough. In the first scene, we go to the jail, and Astolfo complains about his imprisonment. And the jailer says, oh, don't you know that Paris is besieged by Gradasso, who has a giant named Alfreda? There are also Spaniards. And Astolfo says, if I had been free, I would have gained victory. And the jailer says, I'll discuss it. will see how to set you free. Well, this shows that the jailer would like to set Astolfo free, but he doesn't have the means to do it. So does he come back? In fact, he doesn't come back. We never hear from him again. So how is Astolfo freed according to Agrippino Manteo? And here's the scene. Galerana cries, voices of the people, that Astolfo be set free. Galerana has Astolfo released and entrusts the people to him. Astolfo goes into the square and gathers together the people in order to go into battle. He leaves. Galerana prays for victory. It's very short. There's not a lot there, but for me it changes everything, because now Agrippino has brought Galerana to center stage. There's not a power vacuum. She is in charge. She gives the command to Astolfo, but she doesn't do it on her own initiative. The people are still absolutely crucial, but we don't see them on stage. We have their voices in the background. So it's very realistic that the people do not have the physical means, they don't have the power to get the keys and open the prison. Not even the jailer had the keys, right, to open the prison. But the people bring about this change by the power of their voices. And the fact that they're off stage means that Agrippino didn't have to gather 10 or 20 puppets to show a group of people. He could have, only one person raised their hands for puppet theater, but even today in Sicilian puppet theater, when there's a council and Charlemagne arrives, you can hear the knights go, "Viva, viva, Carlo, viva!" You hear, "Viva, viva, viva!" And it sounds like there's a whole bunch of people. And it's only the voice of the puppeteer. So it's very effective. And here you have an indication that Agrippino was using this technique to give the sense of the voice of the people to bring up as a catalyst, to bring about change. Now, Galerana starts off weeping. She's crying. She's just the distraught wife of Charlemagne with nothing. There's nothing she can do. She doesn't have a sword. She's not going to go challenge Gradasso of Sericana. And yet, by freeing Astolfo, at the end of this very short scene, she's no longer crying. She is praying for victory. And so you have this hopeful sense that Astolfo will, in fact, save Christendom, which he does. He defeats Gradasso. Then he remonstrates with Carlo Magno for having put him in prison and having believed the treacherous Gano di Magonza. And then he basically removes his consent. He says, "I'm leaving Paris. I don't want to serve under you, and I'm going to find Orlando and Rinaldo." And then he heads off as the victor. So in this particular scene, Agrippino sets the stage for Astolfo to take command, not because he just assumes it, or even because the people give him the power, but because the empress, the reigning sovereign in the absence of Carlo Magno, is the one who has him freed and gives it to him. So that's my example. And a closing quote, Bilbert in The Art of the Puppet said, "Altogether, it was a tremendous tour de force, and at the core of it were Agrippino Manteo's dramatic inventiveness and irreplaceable scripts." So what I tried to do with this example, and even in a more extensive way in the book through the comparative analyses, was to try to show the dramatic inventiveness within those irreplaceable scripts. So those scripts are held some by the Manteo descendants and many by the Italian American Museum. I've scanned as PDFs all of the ones that I know that are extant, and as soon as the Italian American Museum puts studied and enjoyed very, very widely. And I hope that I made you curious about them and that you'll want to look at the scripts. And the final image is of a Christian captain, and this particular puppet was restored by Greg Plone, who was a graduate. He did his master's in the UConn Public Arts program. And so I thought, since he's connected to UConn and since he owns and restored a Manteo puppet, it would be a fitting way to end tonight. So thank you.
Great, very exciting. We want to have questions from the audience here in person and online. And I was wondering about the structure of these the episodes of the epic. I'm thinking of Rahul Kunathara here, who had an exhibit here of South Indian shadow puppetry, and comes from a tradition of epic storytelling from the Ramayana. And I think of the structures of Indonesian epic puppet theater, which often follows a particular series of set pieces, if you will, court scenes, battle scenes, love scenes. Is there a kind of, for those who aren't familiar, is there a kind of set structure for the episodes of, over 300 episodes, 370 or so episodes of the Manteo epic, and what are those scenes?
Okay, there are some set scenes, and Antonio Pasqualino talks about them in his book, L'Opera dei Pupi. So you do have the council scenes, so you have battle scenes, garden scenes, love scenes, enchantments. I would kind of even pull back from that to the structure of the Renaissance poems themselves, which combine the Carolingian epic. So think the Song of Roland, where you have the battles of kind of collective armies, together with the Arthurian romance, the Breton cycle, where you have knights who go out into the forest on their own, seeking adventure, running into enchantments, battling dragons. And the Italian Renaissance epic is often called the Romance epic because it merges those two genres, and that merging of romance and epic, so love intrigues, quests, magic, monsters, gets mixed and merged with the kind of the larger epic themes of battle, and that gets worked into Giusto lo dico, Storie dei Paladini, and therefore into the puppet plays. So any particular puppet play may not have, say, all of the set scenes, but will very likely go from a romance episode to an epic episode in an interlacing way. So it's called entrelacement. I have a terrible French accent, but so interlacing of scenes was part of the Renaissance romance epic, and it is very much part of Sicilian puppet theater. So today, if you see an episode, it's going to be a set piece that has beginning, middle, and end, because the puppeteers don't expect the audience to return if they're tourists. But the episodes that went on every night would keep the suspense, the cliffhanger, and so the episodes were ongoing from one episode. The episodes were ongoing from one play to the next. So you would have to keep coming back to find out the conclusion.
Thank you. I feel like the idea of epic puppet theater is sort of unusual today. Like we think about it in terms of the Indian traditions that Rahul's family is part of, or Matthew Cohen's work with Wyong. But then, maybe especially for the younger puppeteers here from the Puppet Arts program, I wonder if it's sort of an unfamiliar form. And we were talking earlier that there are, epic forms like soap operas that go on for years and years and years, or we were talking Game of Thrones. There's Netflix series. There are these structures of episodes that sometimes follow a similar pattern. Not so much with puppet theater. So it's fascinating to me, but I think it's sort of unusual now. Do you have a sense of the nature of this epic being a rare bird in contemporary culture and modern culture, and why that might be? It's sort of a lame question. But
No, it's an absolute great question, because there's, for years, some theorists said, oh, well, epic is dead, and then it was replaced by the novel. And yet, the epic keeps coming back in different ways. So we don't tend to have Orlando in the front of our minds, and probably even Italians today don't have Orlando at the front of their minds. So there has been a replacement of the stories, and yet I think there is still, I don't want to say a need for epic, but maybe an attraction to epic, whether children watch, I don't know, Batman and Superman, or what was it my son used to watch, the Ninja Turtles, Mutants, what is that? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay, so in a way that this is another version of epic stories, because they're heroes who do something that requires courage and valor, and something more is at stake for their communities and not just for themselves. And I think there's an impulse. There's a recent book by Robert Crossley on the epic today, and we don't need to expect epic to be a long poem. It could be even on my site, World Epics, someone convinced me that Atlas Shrugged should be considered an epic, and so I included introduction on that, because John Galt is, in a way, a hero where more is at stake than himself. And so I think we can find epic impulses and tendencies in our modern society, even though we've lost the epic traditions that many cultures had cultivated for centuries, not only through puppetry, but through oral traditions, and that today are less felt.
I don't want to dominate the conversation here, I'm very excited. I think first of all, the flexibility that Agrippino Manteo showed in modifying or writing his own versions of these epics, which makes me think of a term that Matthew Cohen, I think coined, like post-traditional, this way of taking tradition and reinventing it. And I think of the difference between Sicilian marionette theater in Sicily and in New York, in downtown New York, in Little Italy, and how that must have been different. But I think I definitely wanted to ask you about one of the underlying themes, which didn't come up so much when you were talking about the elements of Sicilian epic, which is the conflict between Christianity and Islam, which plays large now, certainly, and like with the three puppets out front in the lobby, two are Christian knights and one is a Saracen with a half moon on their helmet. And I wondered, what's your sense of how that conflict shows up in, for example, the Manteo work? Or is it kind of buried within the romance aspects and other parts of the epic structure?
That's a great question, and it depends on the author whose work is being adapted in Giusto Lodico, and therefore in Agrippino Manteo in any given episode. So it's one of the themes running through the Carolingian epic, and yet the poets, especially Boiardo and to some extent Ariosto, work against the grain because there are many friendships between Christians and Saracen characters. There's lots of conflict within the Christian ranks, and so in fact I wrote an essay for you for your volume on the 2021 alterity in puppetry
and
alterity. Okay, and I think it's called Diversity and Alterity in Sicilian Puppet Theater, because my thinking is if you look for alterity, you find it. You can find episodes where the Christians are fighting the Saracens. If you look for diversity, you find episodes where the Christians are marrying the Saracens and where the treacherous character is the Christian brother. And so I think you would need to go episode by episode to come up with it's a complex picture. They assumed the backdrop was the invasion of Italy and France from North Africa. And that comes from first Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato, where the North African king Agrippino invades France. And then it goes back to a historical basis, and the stories get elaborated just the way that the Song of Roland got elaborated in a way out of, not to say out of proportion, but the Basque attack on Charlemagne's rear guard after Charlemagne had been in Spain as an ally of one Muslim sovereign against another Muslim sovereign was completely rewritten in the literary tradition as a kind of crusade in Spain of Christians against Muslims, who were called Saracens at the time. That is completely false according to the historical record, and yet that is what caught on the imagination. Some scholars have said it's because the story was very handy along the pilgrimage route of Santiago de Compostela, and so the Camino, the Camino would tell the legend of Roland, who lost his life in the battle there, and it became one of the mainstays of French literature for a certain period, for many, I would say, ideological reasons. So the poems are very complex, and I think a great part of those poems is that they push against that narrative, which is kind of collectivist, that there's one group versus another group, because they're very interested in the individual characters of the knights, which is the fascinating part, is the character development.
And that makes it more interesting than just either you're right or you're back.
Right.
People online with questions, but people in the audience who might have questions, yes.
Hi. I was wondering, I don't know if you can know the answer to this question. I'm wondering if the performance was always in Italian, and at what point maybe that would have changed to English. And you mentioned some of this like later on they're in English because they're performing at symphony space and so on. But do you know anything about how the language changes like in the 30s or 40s or anything like that? If there's a mixture of all the scripts later on are still in Italian or if they are in English.
And just for the people online, the questions about the nature of language in the Manteo performances, if it's always in Italian or other languages.
Thank you for that question. And I have to say, Tina, what's your last name? Chiappetta, who is a faculty member at UConn, just told me that she was my student in 1993 in an Italian cinema course. So that's very special to me. Okay, to answer your question, from the family and from the scripts, I will give you my best guess that Agrippino performances were exclusively in Italian, but most likely the farcical character Peppinino, who in the Catanese puppet theater would speak in dialect, would have spoken in dialect because it would have been a separation from the world of the knights. So Giusto Lovico wrote in Italian, the puppeteers wrote their plays in Italian when it came to all of their Sciabara characters. And then the characters at the edge, who were farcical characters or realistic characters who improvised, would be speaking in their dialect. As far as the children of Agrippino, so Mike Manteo, when he became Papa Manteo II, for a long time, they actually performed in Italian. And at Symphony Space, the director, whose name I don't remember, but I did write it in the book, Isaiah Sheffer? Yes, thank you. Wrote up in rhyme, in English, a description of each scene before it would be performed so that the audience would have the pleasure of hearing some verse in English and knowing what was going to happen. So they did perform in Italian. Some newspaper articles talk about them performing in Italian. However, I did see two performances, thanks to Nancy Staub, and another thanks to the International Museum of Marionettes in Palermo. And the performances were taped, one in Washington, D.C. and one in New York. And there was a mix. There was Mike and Ida who spoke in English and then who added some Italian into it so that the audience would always follow along. So I think their desire was to perform in Italian, but realistically they adapted not only the stories, but also the language to their audience.
Other questions? I think I'm going to use the mic, let people speak to the microphone. Oh, thank you.
Were the performances ever performed in Latin early on, or always in Italian? Or
I believe always in Italian. I've never heard of the performance in Latin. And I did find, prior to the performances based on Giusto Lovico from 1858 to 1860, I did find 3 very lengthy notebooks in the University Library in Rome, one based on Pulci's Morgante, one based on Boiardo's Orlando Innamorato, and one based on the Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. Very lengthy notebooks in Italian.
Thank you.
Are there any Sicilian marionette performances coming up in the US that you know of, or is there any way that you've seen it here in the US?
I have my fingers crossed that when the Italian American Museum opens at the end of May, the beginning of June, they are in conversation with the one performing Catanese puppet theater company, the Fratelli Napoli, who have set aside the dates and who are willing to come to New York to perform 4 times during that week, but it hasn't been set in stone because the funding is still in the process of being found. I don't know if I can even put it that way, but so I'm hoping, and it's in the discussion and planning stages, but it hasn't been put into writing yet. So if that happens, I will let Dr. Bell know immediately so that he can also let everyone know at the UConn and the Puppets Arts program, and also the Italian program.
Are there any questions from the Facebook audience?
Well, we actually have an antidote that I thought was kind of cool. Lisa Rampula Bress says that she saw them in the New York public schools in the 1960s and then later taught a class in puppetry at the Staten Island Museum and was surrounded in a room by them in the 1980s and 90s. So she was just saying how amazing and influential that was, getting to be surrounded by these puppets.
Wow, can she email me?
Yes, I'll make sure to message that. I have a question. Getting to install these puppets, I feel like we got up close and personal. And one of them, instead of a shield, the original shield has a hubcap as the shield. And I love those kind of things where you see these puppets kind of grow as they're being performed, and instead of being thrown away, being fixed with things like hubcaps. And it made me kind of wonder about the collection as a whole. I know Mike the son mentioned that some of them, I think at least one of ours is from like probably 1923, from when they came to the United States. But in the collection overall, can you tell which ones came over, which ones were built, if new ones were built with the children as they kind of went on, and what kind of changes you see in the designs as kind of these kids took over from the grandparents?
It's a great question. The puppets that Greg Pallone restored, when he took off the original armor and clothing, saw the date 1921, so is assuming that that is the date that the puppet was originally constructed. There are various conflicting accounts in newspaper articles from the decades after the theater closed, and one says that the puppets were eaten by rodents and then thrown out by the landlord. However, in the early 1960s, there's another newspaper article that says the Manteo family salvaged the puppets and were refurbishing them. So it appears that various, not all, but various of the puppets did make it from Agrippino's theater to the theater of Mike and his siblings, and that Mike very regularly refurbished the puppets. There's the documentary that I mentioned earlier by Tony DeNono. It's One Family, Knock on Wood, and there's a scene where Tony DeNono takes you to Mike's workshop, and you can see him working on the puppets. And I think Dr. Bell mentioned earlier that scene where you could see him hammering out a toaster or
Something like that.
Something. And so they did constantly, especially Mike, constantly worked on the puppets. Now, I would not, this is not my area of expertise, I would not be able to look at the puppets and figure out what they are. However, I'm glad you asked me that question, because in the Italian translation of the book, which will be coming out in June, Alessandro Napoli, who is a scholar of puppetry, but also a member of the Fratelli Napoli family, was gracious enough to write a chapter for me on precisely the construction of the puppets. And looking at the Manteo puppets, and him being an expert in Catanese puppet theater, could see that some of the elements of the puppets had divergences which either would be unique to the Manteo family or would be more like the Palermo tradition. So he made 4 hypotheses, and one would be that the Manteo brought over puppets from, say, the Crimi style before there was such a divergence between Catania and Palermo. Another hypothesis is that the Manteo would have purchased puppets, because also newspaper articles mention this, that Agrippino would buy up the puppets of other puppeteers who were closing. And so he could have bought puppets from other collections and used those. And the third hypothesis is that he had his own innovations. And then the fourth is that a combination of all of the above.
Thank you.
Right. Other questions, comments from the audience? Yes.
I wouldn't want everybody to go away this evening without knowing that this is still a living tradition in Sicily. And I just wondered if you could share some of your experience, having been there recently, what it's like today in Sicily.
Okay. I was going around for various summers beginning, I think, 2001 and taping the performances. And if you see a performance that is for tourists, it's going to not be as intricate. If you see a performance on the square at night in the summer for a local audience, it might be more elaborate. There's also differences from one puppeteer company to another. So the Napoli family in Catania have written out scripts that are very developed. I mean, it's an art, it's a living art, and they go forward not catering to anybody, but preserving a tradition to make it vital today. You have the Cuticchio family, the two branches. You have Mimo Cuticchio, who's a genius, and he does traditional puppetry, but he does his own creative forms of puppetry in kind of 360 degrees. And then you have the cousins, Franco Cuticchio and his siblings, who do traditional puppet theater in a very serious way. You have Enzo Mancuso, you have the Argento family, Salvatore Bumbello. You have a core of puppeteers who want to preserve the art. And on the one hand, you could say, well, the single play as opposed to the serial play loses a lot, but it keeps the tradition alive, and a lot of puppeteers put in creativity and thought in actually making a story work in the space of an hour. And so I don't think it's going to become the most popular form of entertainment the way it was for a century, but I don't think it's going to disappear, because even the children of today's puppeteers seem very passionate, as far as I can tell.
It's so interesting because when we... Oh, go ahead. I've talked too much. Should have... Please, question.
Thank you. Two marginal questions. One was, you mentioned that there was a dissemination of the tradition of Sicilian puppeteer theater in Tunisia. And I was wondering if you have any information about other places where that could have happened. For instance, Argentina, where there was a huge Italian community, or other places. And the other question was really fascinated. I'm not sure I can phrase it well, but by the role of the Italian language, because it's very official in a context like Sicily, in Italy at the time, where the vernacular, the dialects are prevalent. So I wonder whether there was a official function, role of puppet theater, especially in the place of immigration like in the US. So if there was some relation, how the authorities, Italian authorities in America or Italian authorities in Italy would see the role of theater.
In terms of the first part of the question, I don't know. I know about the Tunisian example. I don't know about Sicilian puppet theater in Argentina or stuff that grew in response to it. But
I wish somebody would research this and write a book on it. Joseph Shora mentioned to me that he had gathered some information that he then gave to the Library of Congress. I don't think there's a lot of information out there, but a historian could probably dig up something. Unfortunately, at the time when puppet theater was popular, the academics or the intellectual class disdained it and did not give it the serious attention that we would want to give it today. And so we have the disadvantage of our predecessors not having been serious enough to investigate and to document and to interpret and to preserve the history of the puppet theater while it was happening. But certainly in the Italian immigrants in Tunisia not only perform their own puppet theater, but there's documentation that they would lease their puppets to the Muslims during Ramadan so they could perform their own puppets. And there are even examples of the puppet plays that were staged in Tunisia with the characters including the Christian who was the female who was abducted and the captain who would come and get killed. And so there is some kind of documentation and almost a kind of a mirror image.
The second half of your question was about, if I'm understanding, well, you must understand it.
I completely, I was thinking
about
Tunisia.
Like official Italian culture and government's attitudes towards opera di Pupi. Was that something else?
I think they were quite against it because Giuseppe Pitre had to defend puppet theater in, I think it was the 1880s, maybe 1890s, but I think 1880s, because the newspapers were saying that we don't need this kind of immorality with rebellious characters like Rinaldo who are stirring up the masses towards rebellion. And because really a lot of the stories in the Paladins of France would show Carlo to be tyrannical and not only naive, but really in cahoots with Gano. And so this led the newspapers who were representing the government to talk about maybe we should close down these theaters. And Giuseppe Pitre, rather than let's say, champion the Rinaldo character and say, well, yeah, it's good that he does that, took a different strategy and said, no, these stories teach morality. They teach justice and upholding values, Christian values, and these stories are really educational, and therefore they should not be closed down, they should be promoted. So there was never, from what I gathered, any sense of the government or officials at the time wanting to promote puppet theater. Maybe now there's that puppet theater is considered folklore, and I took a picture of that because I found it on the poster of the Palermo tourist office, so I'm not making it up. The governments, I think, want to give the impression that they support the local artisans and actors and puppeteers. I don't know personally to what extent that is true or not. I think if you ask the puppeteers, they probably say not, but I can't speak for them.
Great. Are there more questions? We're sort of getting to the end of our evening together.
I was just curious, for contemporary Sicilian theaters, whether they've changed the puppet construction at all. Sorry if you mentioned this, but they're just so heavy. I'm wondering if they built out of foam now or something, or is wood like essential to the craft?
wood is still essential, but there have been some changes. For example, the Catanese tradition, which is carried on by the Fratelli Napoli, they usually do not use the larger puppets. They have constructed a whole set of puppets that I think are even smaller than the Palermo puppets, so they can transport them easily. They do have a play called L'Oro dei Napoli, Gold of the Napoli family, where they show the difference between the larger puppets and the smaller puppets. So one way to be more practical is to have smaller puppets. Another difference that many companies do is to show the puppeteers manipulating the puppets. So rather than stay behind the curtain, Mimo Coticchio does this a lot, the Fratelli Napoli have also done it, where you can, as a modern, as a contemporary spectator, you can see and therefore appreciate the art that goes into the maneuvering of the puppets rather than getting lost in the story. You see the mastery of the art itself.
Great. Good. Wonderful. Well, this was really exciting. Very great. Really wonderful way to have an introduction or learn more about this important puppet tradition and how it came to the U.S. We can buy your book with a discount code. There's the online Epic Puppetry project, and you'll let us know if we should all get on a bus and go down to the Italian American Museum to see its Napoli family. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you. About the book, I will say that its price is an academic book at $110, so the 20% discount is not really a lot. So if you can ask your library to order it, but the paperback at $40 will be coming out in December, and the ebook is $27.99, and I think the 20% counts for that as well.
Great. The next forum is March 27th with Chung Min Song talking about this